There's a big problem with the American Revolution with the way that we talk about the American Revolution as a war or as a movement against monarchy. That it's a movement that is dedicated to the elimination of monarchy and the establishment of republican government because there's little evidence that American colonists were ideologically uncomfortable with monarchy or opposed to the concept of monarchy before the even the late stages of the outbreak of the American War of Independence. Certainly, there's no indication that English settlers in America were more uncomfortable with monarchy than English people in Old England. Now, historians have identified some anecdotal evidence in, a speech here, a few sermons there, that American settlers had a negative view of monarchy in theory. Some, kind of biblical commentary on King Saul, etc., or from other episodes from the Book of Samuel. But in practice, American settlers did not view Queen Anne or King George the First or George the Second or George the Third negatively, and they did not speak out or act out against monarchy as a in principle. In fact, as late as 1773, Boston, the heart of the rebellion of the opposition movement, Boston held public celebrations of George III's birthday, also annual celebrations of his coronation anniversary, without any counter protests or any sort of political activism suggesting that this public event in Boston is inappropriate or stands against our values. Also in New York, residents erected a statue of George III in 1770 in gratitude for his leadership in the French and Indian War, which had just ended, and also for his role in repealing the hated Stamp Act. In 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill, Americans still referred to George III as their king and appealed to him to protect his people, protect the English settler, the settlers in America, from the intrusive policies promoted by Parliament. Okay, so even in 1775, after those first battles of the war, the settlers saw him as their protector against the evil Parliament. It was only when Americans became convinced that the king supported Parliament that they decided to secede from Britain. Their complaint about Britain's imperial policy throughout the turbulent decade from 1763 to 1775 was never monarchy. Okay, their complaint was not that monarchy is wrong or abusive in principle or in practice, etc. Instead, their complaint was always that Parliament was intrusive, lawless, and promoting unconstitutional policies. Okay, so so that is apparent. Okay, that this Americans were not inherently uncomfortable or opposed to monarchy. Even during the revolutionary crisis, they were not. But then at some point, it is true that that the movement became strenuously Republican, okay, and on principle, standing against monarchy in principle. So the question is, how did this happen? Why did Americans come to resent monarchy so fiercely when throughout the colonial period and even throughout the revolutionary crisis, they were not? And the answer, it seems, is that by 1776, there was no getting around the fact that Parliament pressed forth with its agenda in America because the king allowed it or actively supported it. So the king had aligned himself with his parliament rather than defending his American subjects. So that's definitely a kind of a trigger, um, a transition from viewing the king positively as a protector to viewing the king negatively as an abuser. But beyond Americans' anger at this particular king, at this particular moment, Americans really did, during the course of the war, 1775, 76, Americans really embraced republicanism wholeheartedly during the war, um, and coming to find fault with monarchy itself rather than merely with this king's conduct, with George III's conduct in this particular political crisis. Um, and this is because the conflict with Parliament brought to the fore and exacerbated colonial fears regarding arbitrary power and administrative centralization in the empire. So the revolutionists had complained throughout the decade before the war. They complained that Britain's controversial parliamentary legislation in the 1760s and 70s reflected the will of the rulers, of members of parliament, rather than reflecting the will of the governed. And so they came to have they developed this kind of political science or political theory attention about what is government by consent, what is representation, okay, how should government operate? And they saw in Parliament's policies a mindset that put the will of the rulers ahead of the will of the governed, and they came to oppose it because they felt it on their own skin. And because the debate between Parliament and Americans became framed in this principled and legalistic or constitutional terms about government by consent, etc., it was then Americans therefore applied it also to the institution of monarchy, because monarchy epitomized centralized power. Okay? It epitomized a system that puts the will of the ruler ahead of the will of the governed. Okay? Because monarchy concentrates power not just in one institution, but in one person. Okay? You can see a similar dynamic of a rapidly evolving change in the political philosophy of American settlers with regard to slavery. Before the Revolution, few settlers in America displayed or expressed kind of a real discomfort with slavery as a concept and on principle. There were voices for about a century, but they were marginal, only in few kind of religious circles and marginal ones um, until the war. But once the war began, the legitimacy of slavery became a matter of public debate. And by the end of the war, 5 northern states enacted laws to abolish slavery, with 3 additional states following suit very soon after, in the late 1780s and early 90s. And then another one in 1804. So Americans were the first to abolish slavery voluntarily in their own midst. The first in the Western world to abolish slavery voluntarily in their own midst. That's what happened in the northern states. But in the southern states too, the future of slavery became a real topic of public debate, prompting some slaveholders, mostly in the Upper South, to emancipate thousands of slaves in the aftermath of the War of Independence, even though the institution of slavery persisted, and then following the 1790s and early 1800s, it even expanded thanks to or because of the Cotton Revolution. The point is that the settlers' political rhetoric about Parliament's abuses shaped their moral and ideological sensibilities for a decade before the outbreak of the war, casting their struggle as a struggle against concentrated, arbitrary, and unchecked power. And again, you can see the connection here with slavery. You know, that all of a sudden, with the outbreak of the war, Americans become anti-monarchists and also this anti-slavery sensibilities all of a sudden emerge or rise up. And you can see the connection in the sense that, like monarchy, slavery happened to epitomize and personify exactly this kind of arbitrary power. And because it concentrated power in the hands of one person, a king in this case, slave master in that case. So American efforts to boost public support for the war, for example, with publications such as the Declaration of Independence or Tom Paine's Common Sense, these efforts to raise public support for the war also led Americans to question the legitimacy and morality of both monarchy and slavery.